there's kind of, this is like breaking news. We have discovered that we have an enormous number of artists over the last 100 years who have been outstanding artists and members of the Arts Club and had big influence on the nation's capital, on the architecture, on the sculpture, things like that. And we sort of knew this, but Martin will tell you about the detective work. He's sort of like going, we've got Tutankhamun's tomb, and let him loose, and he's come up with all these great variations. So what you're going to see today is the tip of the iceberg. But what we're saying is it's a wonderful legacy we have. It's a living club. The club is 100 years, a bit more than 100 years old. The building is 200 years old. And this is the whole history of the club coming through the arts members. So I'm going to turn it over to Martin, and from time to time I'll interact with him. Go ahead.
All right. As Michael said, I've been doing a lot of research on the members of the club. And this is a project that started with Judith Nordine when she was president. She said, you know, it would be really nice to have a master list of all our members. So I decided very methodically to go through each membership directory, put them all, every name on a Excel spreadsheet. And then when I was done with each year of names, I went to Wikipedia and I started doing a search one by one. I didn't try to see if any name really leaped out at me. I decided that every person in the club deserved to have their name scrutinized. And of course, over time, some people were very popular in their own day, maybe have lost popularity. But I thought that if they're included in Wikipedia, they're probably important enough for us as members to know. The idea for this tour, to do it as a virtual tour of sort of iconic DC landmarks, of course, connected with the 4th of July holiday. We're probably all going to be watching the fireworks on Saturday, maybe watching the Air Force flyover. And as the fireworks are bursting over the Lincoln Memorial, for example, this will give you some idea of the person, and in his case, Daniel Chester French, who's on our screen now, is associated with those iconic sites. So that's sort of the basic idea. So why don't we begin the tour? Is that okay with you, Michael?
Yes, let's go ahead.
Okay. Well, I thought I'd start with the White House because we do have a number of associations as a club with the White House, including with a sitting president, 2 first ladies, a trailblazing White House photographer, and a very critical White House architect I want to talk with you about. Of course, most of us know that the Arts Club of Washington is in the Monroe House. James Monroe and Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe moved in around 1811 when James Monroe was Secretary of State under James Madison. He stayed there until his election. Of course, he was elected in 1816, inaugurated in March of 1817. Little problem, however, he couldn't move out of the Monroe House because the British, during the War of 1812, had burnt it down. Really, basically all that was left was a shell of the White House. James Madison and then James Monroe continuing got James Hovind, the original architect of the White House, to come back and restore the house to its original grandeur. As a result, James Monroe stayed in the what's today the Arts Club of Washington, 2017 I Street, until October of 1817. So the first 6 months of his presidential administration was spent here in the Monroe House. And those of you who have been to the house for parties or cocktail receptions, the jazz lounge that we were doing every Thursday night, are familiar with this room. This is the front parlor of the Monroe House. And this reputedly is where James Monroe and Elizabeth Monroe held the first inaugural reception. Apparently there were people lined up down the street, walked up the wonderful staircase that we're so familiar with at 2017 I Street, and greeted the President and First Lady.
I'd like to interrupt here that this is a room that's alive right now. Recently, Diane Rehm, about a few months ago, did a presentation of her book. And we had a bar over in the corner where you see that little table by the fireplace. And Diane was talking and signing books there. So it's an alive place. Also, I understand that Monroe's wife didn't come to the party. She stayed upstairs, but everyone else did. So this is a place where the history is still going on and the parties are still going on.
Great. Yeah, Elizabeth Monroe did have a lot of health issues, and she was often criticized as First Lady for being unsocial. The other connection we have, another First Lady connected to the Arts Club, is First Lady Edith Roosevelt. I didn't know this before I started doing my master list. Maybe some of the other members like Judith and June or Henry knew that, but it was a real surprise to me. She was actually one of our charter members, meaning she joined in 1916 when the club was founded. This is an interesting photograph also because it was taken by an Arts Club member, a famous photographer, Frances Benjamin Johnston, groundbreaking woman photographer of her era. I thought this was kind of fun because this is the actual membership application filled out by Edith Roosevelt. You can see there where she has signed her name. And she was sponsored by, among others, Matilda Lysenring. Those of you who've been to the club have also seen Matilda Lysenring's work. She was a very prominent painter of her era. And her husband, Luther Morris Lysingring, was also a founding member of the Arts Club, very important architect here in the city of Washington. You see that she's provided her residence as Oyster Bay, which of course Sagamore Hills, a beautiful home in Oyster Bay, Long Island. I say Long Island since I come from that part of the world myself. And then if you look down at the very bottom of the membership application, notice the action, A+. I guess means that she was accepted as a member right from the get-go.
By the way, I'd like to point out on there, go back one second on that if you can, just stay where you are. Anyway, it said May 21st, 1916, she signed up. That was the year the club was founded. And among the charter members is also the founder of the Phillips collection, Duncan Phillips, yes. One of the most famous museums in the world right now.
Yeah, Duncan Phillips, the father of Duncan Phillips Jr. Duncan Phillips Jr. Actually started the collection in honor of his father and his brother, who were both killed in the flu pandemic in 1918. Duncan Phillips, the father, he was also a great collector of art, friends with our founding president, Bush Brown. And he was one of the very first members, a charter member of the club as well. Later, Duncan Phillips and his wife Marjorie of the Phillips collection then also became members, and they were lifelong members of the club as well. This is Frances Benjamin Johnston. Now, I said earlier, we have that wonderful portrait of the First Lady, Edith Roosevelt. It was taken by Frances Benjamin Johnston, and this is her. This is a self-portrait that she did in her V Street studio. V Street studio was right around the corner from what is today Busboys and Poets. Interestingly, her father, who worked for the Treasury Department, bought the house from John Burroughs. John Burroughs, famous naturalist here during the Civil War era. And I love this photograph because it shows what an independent spirit this woman was. Look at her, she's smoking a cigarette. She's got a hand on a tankard. And of course, she has her skirt hiked up. So you weren't going to mess with Frances Benjamin Johnston.
Martin, about what year would that have been taken? What's your guess?
I think it was taken in 1896. 1896.
Wow.
So she was just a little bit over 30 years old and already fairly well established as an artist. She started her, she moved here to Washington when she was a young woman. Her family was from Rochester, New York. She was mostly educated at home, although she did spend some time at a girls' academy in Maryland. But she studied at the Paris's Académie Julian. The reason she went to Académie Julian is because it accepted women. Most of the academies back then didn't. She came back to Washington. She got interested in photography. Guess how? She was sent a Kodak by George Eastman. The very first Kodaks ever sent to anyone were sent to Frances Benjamin Johnston by George Eastman, who was a friend of the family. And that got her started on photography, which she made a career. Now, she was photographing the White House beginning in the administration of James Garfield, 1881. Of course, he was assassinated soon after he was inaugurated. And then she continued with Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, the Harrisons, and then we had William McKinley. Interestingly, William McKinley, the very last photograph of William McKinley taken prior to his assassination was taken by Johnston. Johnston is best known, however, because of her photographs of the Roosevelt family. Of course, we had Edith Roosevelt, the wonderful portrait of the First Lady we showed earlier. This is Quentin Roosevelt. That was the youngest child of Edith and Teddy Roosevelt. Shown here, he's 5 years old. He's on his horse, Algonquin. And of course, he was a real favorite of everybody in the White House, as well as the press corps and others. And he was kind of known for his shenanigans, basically. Right here we see him riding his horse outside the White House grounds. But on one occasion, his brother Archie, a few years older than he was sick in bed in the White House upstairs with the flu. He rode Algonquin into the White House elevator, pressed the button, went up to the second floor, came out and trotted down the hallway to visit Archie. So that finally it broke Archie's fever. He laughed so much at this episode. And then we have another portrait of the Roosevelt. This is Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She was the oldest son of Teddy Roosevelt by his first wife, also named Alice. And she was a real pistol. She was kind of like, excuse me, Quentin was, but much older, so she could do a lot more harm. Teddy Roosevelt was always getting grief about Alice's shenanigans, and he was once asked if he could do anything about her behavior. And he said, I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot do both. And of course, Alice got back at him a little bit later when she quipped that Teddy Roosevelt wants to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening.
That was great. No, Martin, I was just going to kind of emphasize that this is a photo that was taken by Francis Benjamin Johnson, our member, and all the photos we're looking at, she took them. She was there.
Yes, she took Edith, she took Quentin, and now she took
and more that you're going to show us now.
Alice. That's the end of our Francis Benjamin Johnson photographs, though, because now we're moving on to another person who's associated with a different President Roosevelt, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is Lorenzo S. Winslow, who was the White House architect under Roosevelt, FDR, and Harry Truman. He was an Arts Club member in the 50s and 60s, and in fact, he served as our president in 1954. So if you ever go into the library and notice the Hall of Presidents, he's up there in the corner, Lorenzo Winslow. He was originally from Massachusetts, went to MIT, studied architecture, started a career in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the people of Greensboro, North Carolina consider him to be one of their proud sons, although not a native, because of the architecture he did there. Great Depression hits, he went bankrupt and he had to move to Washington, get a federal job like so many people did in that day. He got a job working for the Office of Public Buildings and Public Parks. And in this capacity, he met Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Why? Franklin Roosevelt, of course, disabled president from polio, the only real exercise he could get was swimming. And he asked Winslow to create a swimming pool for him. The president was so happy with the swimming pool and how it turned out that eventually he named Winslow the White House architect. And in that capacity, he did a lot of work for Roosevelt and then for Harry Truman. Now, moving on to Harry Truman, of course, who succeeded President Roosevelt when he died in office. Harry Truman really did not like being at the White House, and his wife, Bess, hated it even more. They were used to a sort of much more easygoing lifestyle in Independence, Missouri. Harry Truman famously called the White House the Great White Jail. And he thought one way that he could get out of jail was if he had a porch to sit out on. And Bess Truman also believed much in porches because they had a great big porch at home in Independence, Missouri. So he charged Winslow, along with another architect who is consulting, William Adams Delano, to make him a porch. They built a porch in the south portico. And what's interesting, I think, in another connection with the Arts Club is that the south portico was originally put into the White House by James Hoban at the bequest of James Monroe in 1824. Of course, when it was originally put in, no balcony, it went all the way up from the base all the way to the top there with those beautiful neoclassical columns. Well, the historic preservationists were horrified that they were defacing the south portico of the White House and grumbled to no end, but Harry Truman still went ahead. Part of it was because he was afraid without a porch, Bess would always keep going back to Independence, Missouri. So this was a way for him to keep her at home. And in fact, it worked so well that after it was finished, Harry and Bess were frequently there reading out on their porch. And of course, every other president since then has just loved hanging out there. The Kennedy children used to love to play out there, and a lot of photographs of the Kennedy kids hanging over the railing of the porch. Oops, I'm going in the wrong direction here. Apologies. Now, the porch was one thing, but much bigger problem faced Winslow a little bit later the same year. The porch was put in 1948. Well, right around that same time, they started noticing that the White House was having a lot of structural problems. The beautiful chandeliers in the East Room, which were designed by Louis Comfort Timpany, who parenthetically was also a member of the Arts Club of Washington, started swaying. Harry Truman's bathtub started sinking through the floor, as did Margaret Truman, his daughter's piano. The engineers were called in. They said, we really have to do something about the condition of this house. It is so bad, it really should be torn down. Well, Harry Truman said, absolutely not. He's not going to tear down the White House. But he took a nod from James Madison and James Monroe, the fourth and fifth presidents, after the War of 1812. Instead of tearing down the White House and starting from scratch, they decided to rebuild it from within. And that's what Harry Truman charged Lorenzo Winslow to do, which is what he did. The project lasted from 1948 to 1952. The end of the project, 1952, guess what Lorenzo Winslow did? He retired. He had really had a well-earned rest. And then after that, of course, we put him to work at the Arts Club. He became president in 1954.
A bit of an aside here, we have a story which is probably proved untrue, but there is a tunnel at the bottom of the Arts Club, and there's been speculation that there was a tunnel from the Arts Club house to the White House, and some experts said no, it was only sewage, but we don't believe that. Go back.
What's the point of facts when you have apocrypha, right?
That's right.
I know that Dwayne and Bill are listening in, and as tour guides, I'm sure they've never made up a story in order to entertain tourists.
Yeah.
Well, now moving on to the another great icon in Washington, D.C., of course, is the Lincoln Memorial, dedicated in 1922 on the Memorial Day, 1922. It was dedicated in the presence of Lincoln's only surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, and also President Warren Harding was there, and a former president and now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Howard Taft. The architect of the temple was a man named Henry Bacon, but more importantly from our perspective is that the architect was this man, Daniel Chester French. And here he's shown with a model of the Lincoln Memorial. Daniel Chester French was probably the most, next to St. Gaudens, probably the most famous and illustrious architect of his day. And like Edith Roosevelt, he was also a charter member of the club. He joined while we were in formation in those first 6 months of 1916. Chester French comes from Concord, Massachusetts. His family was acquainted with the sage of Concord, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And as a young man, the age of 25, he was, or 21, he was awarded the commission to do the Concord Minuteman statue, which is in Concord, Massachusetts, honoring the Minuteman from the American Revolution.
A bit of an interruption here. I actually remember walking exactly by that statue in Concord and admiring that. So
Yeah.
now I know who did it.
Well, it was quite a sensation for its day, and it really just started him on an illustrious career, as I said, ending the pinnacle probably being his Lincoln Memorial. The other interesting thing about Daniel Chester French here in Washington, D.C., there's another French-Bacon collaboration. And Michael, I think you may know it because I think you walk by it every day.
I live only 2 blocks from it, DuPont Circle.
The DuPont Circle fountain, which was dedicated the year before the Lincoln Memorial, was also a collaboration of Daniel Chester French and Henry Bacon. And also, interestingly, there was a Italian carvers from the South Bronx called the Piccirilli Brothers. And the Piccirilli Brothers carved Lincoln for the Lincoln Memorial and also those beautiful muses in the DuPont Circle fountain. Here's another iconic site, of course, which is the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial. I'm using the official term, although most of us know it by the name Iwo Jima Memorial, because it's depicting the famous battle in 1945 at the end of the war with Japan, where the U.S. Marines captured the island of Iwo Jima and they raised the flag. The flag raising was captured by a photographer, Joe Rosenthal, and of course it became immediately a rallying cry for the American people and the troops in particular. It was dedicated, the memorial, in 1954, and appropriately enough, the dedication was overseen by President Dwight Eisenhower. First, Dwight Eisenhower was in charge of Allied troops during our war against fascism. Now, Felix de Weldon was a young Navy man. I don't know what his rank was, but he never advanced too high in the Navy. In 1945, he was an immigrant from Austria, eventually became a naturalized citizen in 1945, probably because of his military service. He sees Joe Rosenthal's wonderful photograph in the news, and immediately he starts on a maquette and decides he wants to create a memorial to this moment. He works with a local architect named Horace Peasley, and the two of them begin to petition Congress. They send it to Congress to say, we have a wonderful idea for a Marine Corps War Memorial. Well, Congress immediately liked it, but it took them a while. Of course, you had to finish finishing the war and then financing it. But eventually they did award the two men the commission to build this war memorial. Those of you who know the story of the Iwo Jima Memorial probably know that it's based on actual soldiers who were raising the flag. And at the time, there were 6 soldiers. 3 of them were killed in action during the battle, and another 3 survived. And Felix de Weldon decided to make it as realistic as possible. He used the 3 surviving soldiers and photographs of the dead soldiers, if he had them, in order to model his soldiers. And here we see Rene Gagnon. I'm making a mess of that French surname, but he was one of the soldiers who was believed at the time that this memorial was done to be one of the soldiers who lifted the flag. Bill and Dwayne can probably tell you that over time, a lot of the soldiers who originally identified, they decided that looking more closely at the photograph that maybe it wasn't that one, it was somebody else. And eventually Rene was acknowledged as being present, but not an actual flag raiser. But in any case, here he is depicted in the...
Martin, a question about presence also.
Yeah.
Is the man at the sculpture, is that Felix Rene? Or rather, Felix de Weldon?
Yes, that's Felix de Weldon, who's got his sculpting implement. We see that implement with Bush Brown in the Arts Club portrait. And that's Rene there, the soldier who was present at the flag raising. Notice how big the head is. That's because the final soldiers in the memorial are 32 feet recall.
I also understand, by the way, without evidence, that that photo was taken just after Felix Rene had lunch at the Arts Club.
Well, he actually was a member of the Arts Club as he was doing this whole thing.
Okay.
So we can claim that that honor. All righty. Now we're moving on to the Smithsonian Castle. Of course, what would a visit to Washington be without a visit to the great castle? And as most of us Washingtonians know, is named for James Smithson, who never visited Washington, D.C. in his life, but was sort of entranced by this new republic. And in his will, he left his money to his son, but under the stipulation, or to his nephew, he had never had children. And he told, if his nephew didn't have any heirs, the money would go to the Smithsonian to build an institution for the diffusion of knowledge. And so that's how the Smithsonian Institution came about. Now we have two associations with the Smithsonian I'd like to talk about. One is that James Smithson, you may not know this, but he's actually buried in the Smithsonian's crypt. He never came to America during his lifetime, but after his death, he died in 1829. The cemetery that he was buried in Genoa, Italy, at a certain point they decided to redevelop the property. They were turning it into some sort of a mining pit. And the Smithsonian got wind of this, and they said, you know what, we'd like to get James Smithson's body and bring him to the institution that he founded. They sent Alexander Graham Bell over to Genoa, Italy, and Graham Bell brought James Smithson back here. What's the connection with the Arts Club? Well, the memorial plaque for the tomb of James Smithson, which was first at his grave, and now it's here in Washington by the tomb, was done by William Ordway Partridge in 1896, who was also a member of the club. He was a member of the club mostly in the last years of his life, but he also has another association with Washington, D.C., because he was a professor at Columbian College, which we know today as the George Washington University. His best-known sculpture is not a memorial plaque, but a Pocahontas in Jamestown, if you've ever been down there. Now here's Grace Lincoln Temple. She was one of Washington, D.C.'s most prominent interior designers. And the project she worked on for the Smithsonian was the Children's Room. Now, the Children's Room came about when Smithsonian Secretary Samuel Pierpont Langley decided that children needed a place to enjoy and hopefully gain some knowledge. But in order for it to be accessible to children, it had to be a desirable place. So what they did is they put all of the, if you notice around the walls, all of the exhibit spaces are very, very low, so a child can actually see it. And they would have lots of birds and other animals would be in the case. And then in the center of the room, there's an aquarium full of fish. Now, Grace Lincoln Temple was tasked with doing all of the design work around the walls, trying to integrate the look and feel of the place, make it a welcome place for children. She did this largely through the use of trellises and beautiful leaves and birds. If you look at the ceiling, for example, it has this very charming picture. It's as if when you look up in the ceiling, you're looking out into the sky. You have a trellis surrounding, and then you have these really adorable, looks like parakeets to me.
Martin, I noticed also that Grace was one of the founding members.
Grace also was a founding member of the Arts Club of Washington, and she remained a member up until her death in 1931.
So she joined along with Mrs. Roosevelt.
Mrs. Roosevelt and also Daniel Chester French. And this gives us another look. This is the current look of the Children's Room. Over time, the Children's Room was basically papered over. At a certain point in time, they were redoing the room yet again, and somebody dug down under the under the layers of paint, and they found the original stencils of Grace Lincoln Temple. Fortunately, we still had her design book, so they recreated her design and they recreated the room. Today you can find it. It's sort of the entranceway to the garden off of the Smithsonian Castle. But if you look up at the ceiling, you can see again the beautiful open ceiling with the two parakeets swinging around. All right, now of course we have the U.S. Capitol. You can't go to Washington without seeing that. And the U.S. Capitol, right off of the rotunda, is the old hall which housed the House of Representatives. Today it's used as National Statuary Hall. And I want to stop at National Statuary Hall for a minute because we had several Arts Club artists who did statues for prominent members of states. As you may know, each state has the right to place 2 statues of prominent citizens in the Capitol. Most of them are in the National Statuary Hall. Others are scattered around the Capitol because of the lack of room. Of the 100+ statues that are in National Statuary Hall collection, about a dozen of them were done by Arts Club of Washington artists. Let me talk about 2 of them in particular. This is a statue of Richard Stockton of New Jersey. He was the assigner of the Declaration of Independence for the state of New Jersey, a very prominent local son, also founder of Princeton University. But interesting for us is that it was sculpted by Henry Kirk Brown. And then it was completed by his nephew and adopted son, Henry Kirk Bush Brown. Now, of course, Henry Kirk Bush Brown, you'll be familiar with. He was the founding president of the Arts Club of Washington. But his uncle was very important in his life. When Henry Kirk Bush Brown was about 8 years old, he was sent off to his uncle, who actually his mother's sister was married to Henry Kirk Brown. And they took the young Henry into their home, and they also, Henry Kirk Brown took him into his studio and taught him the art of sculpting. Now, Henry Kirk Brown is somebody who had a lot of prominence in his day. Maybe not as familiar with him today. If you go to Union Square in New York, the wonderful statue of George Washington was done by Henry Kirk Brown. And then here in Washington, D.C., if you've ever been to Scott's Circle, General Scott, Winfield Scott, was done by Henry Kirk Brown as well. But more importantly to us is this next guy, Henry Kirk Bush Brown. He, of course, was one of the founding members of the Arts Club. The Arts Club of Washington was really founded in his studio in Washington, D.C., and he served as the first president of the Arts Club of Washington. As I said, he was actually the son of a family named Brown, but he decided, since his uncle had taken him in and adopted him as his own, that he took his uncle's last name. So he had Bush Brown, the hyphenated name. That's where the hyphen in Bush Brown comes from. Now, Henry Kirk Bush Brown is known for a lot of really wonderful sculptures, but mostly we know him because of the Gettysburg National Battlefield memorials. He did several other really prominent equestrian statues. Now, one of the things his uncle was famous for was equestrian statues. We have General Scott here in Scott's Circle, George Washington, but Bush Brown learned that skill as well. And so we have the Union Commanding General George Meade at the Battle of Gettysburg, was done by Bush Brown, as well as Generals John Reynolds and John Sedgwick. Also, in 1912, he did the it's called the Lincoln Speech Memorial, which is a commemoration of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Interestingly, this is the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln gave his speech a few months later in November, dedicating the cemetery, and this is located in the cemetery.
When you say this is, you mean today is?
Today is the 157th anniversary. The battle took place over the course of several days, and it was a wonderful 4th of July present for the country when the Union forces prevailed. Now, The bust of Lincoln was done by Henry Kirk Bush Brown. And if you're a visitor to the Arts Club or a member, of course, you're familiar on the right-hand side of our screen with the bust of Lincoln. That's a plaster model. It was done about 8 years before the final dedication of the bronze bust of Lincoln that's now at Gettysburg.
A little side story on that. Martin has been part of the literary committee. We've completely revamped the entire Arts Club library in the last year. And one of the things, this statue has been right in our room there all the time. And he and I think, went to look to the side and found the inscript that said how old it was. And we still couldn't figure out, could we wipe it down or should Antiques Roadshow say, don't dare touch it? But it's quite a lovely piece to have right in front of us all the time.
Yeah, it's funny. We were a little nervous about that.
I don't think we've resolved that yet.
Don't tell anybody. The next stop on the tour is the Library of Congress. The Thomas Jefferson building, of course, being the most beautiful of the three main buildings. I guess there are 4 buildings, actually, built between 1890 and 1897. If you go in there with visitors, you're probably going to take them to this room, which is the main reading room. And I don't know about you, but whenever I have people come into Washington, there's always this awestruck moment when they walk up that little staircase and they're able to look down on the main reading room. Well, we have to thank a number of artists who worked on that, including Daniel Chester French, who did some of the sculptures. But I wanted to focus on Edwin Blashfield. Edwin Blashfield did the interior dome of the reading room. And the interior dome represents the human understanding, surrounded by 12 seated figures representing the 12 epochs of human civilization. Of course, it ends with America and science. It begins with Egypt. You can see Egypt in the center. And then it goes all the way around the dome and ends with America and science. And Blashfield was a member of the Arts Club from about 1919 to 1924. Like me, he's a native of Brooklyn, New York. I guess he talked with an accent like I do. He studied at the Philadelphia Academy of the Fine Arts, served here at the U.S. Commission of the Fine Arts, and he was also a very close friend of Daniel Chester French. Now, the other important room in the Library of Congress is the Coolidge Auditorium. I can remember the first time I went to a concert here many years ago. Thomas Hampson, the American tenor, was singing a selection of art songs. It's a beautiful place for chamber music. But they also have lots of other types of concerts as well, including folk and jazz, probably much more popular than the chamber music recitals. It was given to the country, to the Library of Congress, by the benefactor Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who was a member of the Arts Club as well. I believe she was made a member, take a look here, in 1927, and she remained a member up until her death in 1953. And this is a wonderful etching of her by John Singer Sargent. She's also responsible for starting the Berkshire Symphonic Festival, which we know today as the Tanglewood Festival in Massachusetts.
What also struck me, by the way, is that you had also mentioned in your notes that she commissioned Arnold Copeland to do Appalachia Spring.
Yes, she was a great, she was a pianist herself, and she especially loved chamber music, but she was a great mentor to composers. And one of the pieces that she did commission, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of them by all the famous composers of her day, but Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring was commissioned by Mrs. Coolidge. And
separate from this, about maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, when we celebrated the reinstitution of the arts of the library, setting it up, we had an evening and there was music and poetry. And what we did is we brought in music by 3 women, and outstanding women who had, they're sort of faded from the screen, who were members of the Arts Club in the early, 20s, 30s, Martin?
Yes, yeah, we had music composers, Mary Howe. Oh boy, I'm drawing a blank on the other one who's even more famous. but they would have been people who Coolidge would have been promoting as well as Hans Kindler, who is the founding director of the National Symphony Orchestra, who's a member of the Arts Club of Washington. I'm sure Coolidge and Kindler were close to one another. Now, since we're had a very long, exhausting day of touring, it'd be nice to go to the theater for a little while. And if you were here in Washington, D.C. in 1936, you probably would have wanted to snag a ticket to the most popular musical playing at the time would have been Porgy and Bess, George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. Well, if you did, you would be hearing this man sing, Robert Todd Duncan. Robert Todd Duncan also became a member of the Arts Club of Washington. And Robert Todd Duncan premiered the role of Porgy. George Gershwin himself selected him for the role. At the time, Duncan was serving on the music faculty of Howard University here in Washington, D.C. Now, Todd Duncan, when he agreed to perform here in Washington, when it came the year after it premiered in New York, it premiered in 1935 in New York, 1936 here in Washington, he had one condition, that his people had to have the right to buy tickets and seat anywhere they wanted in the audience. Well, this was a big deal at the time because the National Theater, like most of Washington of that era, unfortunately, was segregated. So the National Theater decided it wanted Porgy and Bess well enough, and Robert Todd Duncan in the title role, that it agreed to integrate the theater for that performance. So now just a kind of a recap for people. I know it's kind of hard to follow, but this is the honor roll that we went through today. We had Edith Roosevelt, the First Lady, Francis Benjamin Johnston, the White House photographer, Lorenzo Winslow, the White House architect. Really, the White House we know today was his work. Daniel Chester French, Lincoln Memorial, Felix de Weldon, the Iwo Jima, Grace Lincoln Temple, Smithsonian Children's Room, Partridge, the memorial plaque, our founding president, Bush Brown, Edwin Blashfield, the murals in the Library of Congress, Coolidge, of a Coolidge Auditorium named for her, and Todd Duncan, American baritone. And then I'd like to just end by telling you if you wanted to do some further reading, here are some books. And as it turns out, these books are all in the Arts Club of Washington's library. So we have Monument Man. It's a new biography of Daniel Chester French, just came out. Woman Behind the Lens. It's a really nice photobiography of Francis Benjamin Johnston. And then Judith Viggers Nordine, our former president, wrote a beautiful piece on the I Street residence of the White House Historical Quarterly a couple of years ago. Shows some wonderful anecdotes of President and Mrs. Monroe's life in the Arts Club house. Hal Matson, who we all know, he was a long-term archivist here at the club. He did the Arts Club Centennial Portrait. And then another member of ours, photographer Bruce White, worked with James Good on Capitol houses. And one of the Capitol houses featured in this book is the Arts Club of Washington.
And I'd like to add some comments about the library at this point, because Martin has been part of the team. Last summer, we spent the month of August going through 1,000 or more books in the library and preening out which could stay alive and which would not, and looking at some of they actually had a takeout library in the 1920s and 30s, so we saw the sign-out cards, and you got the real sense that this place has a huge heritage to it. And then I saw Martin's room where he's sort of he does his archival work, and well, first of all, the books we were smothered in dust. But Martin is even more smothered in dust. And there are these old manuscripts with names and things like that, and he's going through them. So basically what he did is he went through all sorts of manuscripts and pulled out who could be a member here. We didn't have a collection of the names of the members until he started doing that. And that's what an archivist does. Now, the tragedy of it, not the tragedy because it's been a success, but it's only Martin. So I said, anybody, if you're in the Arts Club, consider coming and learning to go through. It's like being a detective. at finding out this wonderful stuff. We have a huge heritage here, and so Martin has done it. And come visit the club and see the library. We visually redesigned it, but also Martin insisted that every book that goes in had to be cataloged, which we thought was impossible, and he did it. So now you can go online and actually see every book as well. So.
Yeah, and I have the location of the catalog because it's online with this company. It's called LIBIB. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen. If you just type in acwlibrary.libib.com, it'll pull up our Arts Club catalog. And I also like to say the doing of the library, the recreation of the library really was the brainchild of Michael as literary chair. And it was the work of lots of people, including, of course, Bill Turner and Dart, Carol, Larry, Rihanna, and I'm probably forgetting a few people. Bill was the one who turned me on to the LIBIB as an online catalog that we could actually use and populate. But we'd really love it if people would actually come to the library and start taking out books. That would really make us feel.
Yeah, I would also like to add that Bill was our genuine librarian. This man had a professional library, and he educated us in what books we could kill, which was so hard to do. But he was heartless in saying what we had to do, and he was right. So we owe a lot to having a very professional result because of Bill.
All right. Are there any questions before we close out? I know we've kept you for quite a while. We went a full hour. But we're happy to answer a few questions before we close out. Sasha, do you have any for us?
Yeah, I have one. Bill asked a very good question. Bill Turner. He asked, was Robert Todd Duncan the first African-American club member? And also, was there any controversy among the club members upon admitting him?
As far as we know, Robert Todd Duncan was the first African-American member. And one of the things I've been I keep hoping I'm going to find an earlier instance, but Duncan did not become a member until 1983. So that's a very, very long time after the club was founded. But as far as I can tell, and anecdotally, that is what I have been told, but it's possible we had an early member. Now, what's interesting is the club did have very people who are very progressively minded. Charles Russell, for example, who was one of the founders of Charles Edward Russell, one of the founders of the NAACP. He was a white man, but he was a member of the Arts Club of Washington. We had Bill Turner. If Bill Turner asked that question, he also knows that we had a long-term member who is a teacher at Howard University, who is the sponsor of our Varshdon, I think her name is, who was the original sponsor of our scholarship program. So lots of really good people. Unfortunately, given the segregation in Washington, D.C., I haven't been able to identify a member earlier than Robert Todd Duncan. All right, well, I'm done. I'm ready for a cocktail. I don't know about anyone else.
So am I.
So am I. Me three.
Thank you all for coming.
Sasha, thank you so much for the tech end of it. Without that, this thing could have been a flop, but you've been wonderful.
Yeah.
But everybody, happy, safe 4th. Everybody, socially distanced, but enjoy all the fireworks and cookout food you can. And I'm just glad that this was such a great event for everybody. So thank you so much.
And to my apostles, thank you for coming too.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.